In 1913, a broke Swedish immigrant stood on a frozen road in Minnesota with a car nobody wants to buy, no money, and no plan. He wasn't an engineer, he wasn't a visionary, he wasn't even a good salesman. But what he did next, out of pure desperation, created an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars and put America on wheels. His name was Carl Wickman, and almost nobody knows it. You've seen the Greyhound bus your entire life, at the highway, at the terminal, in movies, in songs. But here's what they never told you. Greyhound wasn't built by a visionary with a master plan. It was built by a failure, a desperate man who stuffed 18 miners into a 7-seat car just to pay his rent. In this video, we're going to break down 3 things that every American should know and nobody talks about. 1. The humiliating failure that started everything. 2. The ruthless strategy that turned one car into a national empire. 3. The dark chapter that almost erased Greyhound from history and who was really behind it. Stay until the end, because the real story of Carl Wickman is not what you think. It's the winter of 1913, Hibbing, Minnesota, a mining town buried under ice and silence. Carl Wickman has just arrived from Sweden. He speaks broken English. He has almost nothing in his pocket. He gets a job as a diamond drill operator at the mines. But Carl has bigger dreams. He wants to be a businessman. So he does what any ambitious man would do. He invests everything he has into a brand new 1914 Hupmobile. His plan? To sell it, to become an automobile dealer. There's just one problem. Nobody buys it. Days pass, weeks pass, not a single sale. Carl is stuck. He has a car he can't sell, debt piling up, and a Minnesota winter that doesn't care about his dreams. And then, almost as a joke, he makes a decision that changes American history. If nobody will buy the car, he'll charge people to ride in it. 25 cents per ride, Hibbing to Alice. The first day, he drives the route back and forth, cramming as many miners as the car will hold. But Carl doesn't stop there. He starts stuffing 18 miners into a 7-passenger vehicle. 18! The car wasn't built for that. The roads weren't built for that. Safety regulations didn't exist. But the money worked. And Carl Wickman had just discovered something that railroads, politicians, and industrialists had completely missed. Americans would pay to move. By 1915, Carl has a partner, a man named Andrew "Bus Andy" Anderson. Together, they buy a second vehicle, then a third. But Carl's real genius wasn't the buses. It was what he did to the competition. Serious. Every time a rival operator started a route near his, Carl would undercut him, slash prices, run more trips, drive the competitor into the ground. And when that competitor was broke and desperate, Carl would buy him out, not destroy him, buy him. Route by route, town by town, state by state. By the early 1920s, Carl's network has spread across Minnesota. He renames the company Misaba Transportation. It's worth several $1 million. Then he does something that shocks everyone. He walks away. In 1925, Carl sells his stake in Misaba and goes even bigger. He acquires a small operation called the White Bus Line. And then, in a move of almost reckless ambition, he starts merging bus companies across state lines. Nobody had done this before. Nobody had thought this big. The result, the Motor Transit Corporation, 1926, a bus network that stretches across states, sleek gray buses that move like ghosts through the American highway. One of his drivers looks at those gray buses cutting through the fog and says they look like Greyhound dogs. The name sticks, Greyhound. And just like that, Carl Wickman, the failed car salesman from Hibbing, Minnesota, has invented intercity bus travel in America.
But here's the part they leave out of the Wikipedia article. Here's the detail that needs to be documented. By 1929, Greyhound is booming. Americans are riding buses everywhere. And then October 29, 1929 happens, Black Tuesday. The stock market collapses, the Great Depression swallows America whole, and Greyhound, the company Carl built from nothing, nearly dies. Ridership collapses, revenue evaporates, the company is hemorrhaging money. Carl Wickman faces a choice that would break most men: shut it down or bet everything on one moment. And then, almost by miracle, something saves Greyhound, the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago. Millions of Americans need to get to Chicago. Trains are expensive, cars are unaffordable. But a Greyhound bus is cheap, reliable, and everywhere. Greyhound carries hundreds of thousands of passengers to the World's Fair. The revenue saves the company. Carl survives the Depression. But here's the dark detail that history skips over. While Carl was building his empire, the railroads were trying to destroy him. Systematically, deliberately, with money and lawyers and political connections. The railroad industry ran a campaign claiming that buses were destroying America's roads. They lobbied governments, they funded newspapers, they filed legal challenges. Because they understood, before anyone else did, that Carl Wickman wasn't just building a bus company. He was ending the railroad monopoly on American movement, and they were terrified. Carl fought back. He won, but the cost was steep. The battles were brutal.
Here's what that actually looked like. After World War I ended in 1918, train ticket sales began to collapse. Not slowly, fast. Americans had discovered the automobile. The roads were improving, and then this upstart from Hibbing showed that you could move people between cities for a fraction of what the railroads charged. The railroads understood the threat before anyone else did, and they responded the only way monopolies respond when they feel the ground shifting beneath them. They attacked. The first weapon was the road. Railroad executives launch a coordinated public campaign, funded, organized, deliberate, claiming that buses were destroying America's roads, that every Greyhound bus that rolled down a highway was tearing up pavement that taxpayers had paid for, that bus companies were parasites on public infrastructure, taking profits while leaving the damage behind. The newspapers ran it, the politicians repeated it, and there was just enough truth in it to make it dangerous. But here's what they never said in those newspaper campaigns. Railroads had received some of the largest government land grants in American history, billions of dollars in public land just given to them for free. And they called Greyhound the parasite. The second weapon was the law. By the mid-1920s, the railroad lobby had successfully pressured 43 states to regulate bus companies. 43. Licensing requirements, route restrictions, safety rules written so specifically that only large established operators could afford to comply. On the surface, it looked like consumer protection. In practice, it was a wall designed to stop small operators from becoming large ones. And here is the part that twists the knife. Some of those regulations actually helped Greyhound survive. Because here's what Wickman understood that his smaller competitors didn't. He was already large enough to comply. They weren't. Every new regulation that came down from the railroad pressured state legislatures. Every new licensing requirement, every new safety standard killed 10 small bus operators and sent their routes directly to Greyhound. Carl turned the railroad's weapon against them. The third weapon was the price war. As some railroads saw bus companies growing, they slashed ticket prices, sometimes below cost, attempting to bleed bus operators dry before they could build their networks. Most bus operators folded. Wickman did something else. He went to the enemy. In 1925, while other railroads were fighting him, Carl Wickman walked into the offices of the Great Northern Railroad and made a deal with its president, Ralph Budd. Budd was different. While his competitors were spending millions trying to destroy buses, Budd had actually studied the numbers. He understood something his industry refused to acknowledge. Buses and trains were not enemies, they were complements. Buses could serve the routes where trains lost money. Buses could feed passengers into train stations. The war was costing everyone. The partnership could make both sides rich. On May 15, 1925, Great Northern Railroad bought 90% of Wickman's Northland Transportation Company for $500,000, $500,000, into a company that started as a car nobody would buy. But here is the move that made Wickman a genius, and not just a survivor. He didn't take the money and disappear. He stayed. Wickman kept managing the company, now with railroad capital, railroad political connections, and railroad infrastructure behind him. The same railroads that had lobbied against him, their regulatory walls now protected him. Their political connections now worked for him. Their money was his money. He had turned the monopoly's armor into his own. By 1927, Greyhound buses were making transcontinental trips, California to New York. An immigrant who couldn't sell one car in Hibbing was now running a network that crossed the entire nation. By 1931, even with the Depression crushing the company into over $1 million in debt, he held on. By 1934, intracity buses carried 400 million passengers, nearly as many as the entire American railroad industry. 400 million! The same year his enemies claimed buses were parasites. And by 1935, 12 years after the railroads declared war on him, Carl Wickman stood in front of his board and announced record profits of $8 million. $8 million from a car nobody would buy. He didn't beat the railroad. He became its partner. And in doing so, he made himself untouchable.
And by the time Carl Wickman retired from Greyhound in the 1950s, the man who had invented American bus travel was largely forgotten, his name erased from the story of the company he created. Today, Greyhound operates 1,700 buses across 230 stations in the United States. The company Carl built from a single car he couldn't sell is now owned by a European conglomerate, Flixbus. Carl Wickman died in 1961. He never saw the interstate highway system that made his vision permanent. He never saw the millions of Americans who would ride his buses through the night, through the storms, through the decades. The greatest empires in American history were not built by the smartest people in the room. They were built by the most desperate. Carl couldn't sell one car, so he moved a nation. Subscribe, because next week we're going inside another empire, and this one fell.